Welcome to today's panel, which will look at Tehran's regional axis of allied armed groups and how they're responding to the US-Israeli war on Iran. For more than 2 decades, the so-called axis of resistance from Yemen's Houthis to Lebanon's Hezbollah and the plethora of armed groups in Iraq known as the Popular Mobilization Forces has functioned as Iran's forward defense. But in the 2.5 years since October 7th, that model has come under unprecedented strain as the US and Israel explicitly sought not just to degrade individual members of the axis, but to dismantle the network as a whole and shift the locus of confrontation towards Iran itself. Despite attempts to decapitate the leaderships of these groups, they have endured even if their capabilities have been degraded. The June war marked an inflection point with Iranian officials signaling that they would act directly and alone. But this time around, we've not seen evidence of the same. 3 weeks in, and it's palpably clear that the Axis is playing a key role in Iran's intent to foment regional chaos in a bid to escalate the cost of this war to the US, Israel, and their regional allies. But the actors are seemingly functioning according to their own logics of survival. While Hezbollah and several armed groups in Iraq have joined in the fight, the Houthis haven't yet. This panel will look into the individual groups' actions, their reasons for fighting or not, and how they see their relationship to Iran, as well as their place in the security landscape in the years ahead. As a reminder to both our panelists and our audience, today's discussion will be on the record and is being recorded. When we will start with a roughly 40-minute conversation and we'll turn to audience questions after that. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit one using the Q&A box that will appear at the bottom of your Zoom feed. I will be reading and selecting the questions, so please ensure that these are actually questions and not just comments. You're all encouraged to tweet using the handle at @ch_MENAP. So that's MENAP. On today's panel, we're lucky to be joined by our distinguished speakers. We have Maysa Shuja'ad-Din, Senior Researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, Emil Hakim, Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, Senior International Policy Advisor for Arnold and Porter, and the former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Biden administration. And lastly, Chatham House's very own Dr. Renard Mansour, the Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Program. So with that, I'd like to start first with Renard. I'd really like if you could set the scene for us at the top of this conversation. In June, the Axis group stayed on the sidelines, as we saw, but we're seeing a very different dynamic this time around. So I was wondering if you could help explain that dynamic and looking in particular at these networks. Are they resilient? Are they diminished? How connected are they to Iran and to each other? And what exactly determines their decision-making at present?
Thank you, Raya. To answer your question, as you put it, the axis of resistance was probably made for different purposes, for different reasons, for different people. Certainly, one of the functions was, as you mentioned, Iran's forward defense. These groups of armed actors, militias across Iraq, the Levant, Lebanon, Yemen, there to be part of sort of Iran's regional security architecture. And certainly we've seen that severely diminished and degraded since, as you said, October 7th, if not even earlier. Keep in mind that it was as early as 2020 when the US assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the creator of this model, the IRGC, or the sort of the general of the Quds Force, as well as Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis at that time, one of the leaders of the PMF. So this is a network that's been under significant decapitation for over 5-6 years at least. And yet somehow, as much as they've been degraded, as much as their senior leaders have been killed, they still somehow are there. They're still part of these conversations in different ways. And, the questions that we ask are, what is driving, both their survival, but also their decision making? Very clearly, they're all in survival mode. And part of that survival may be connections to Iran, but it's also survival for them in the local context. Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, as Emil, knows and has worked on, is a locally rooted, to some extent, political organization. Same with the PMF, same with the Houthis. They're not mere Iranian proxies as such, but have a complicated, multifaceted structure, which means that they can adapt. And what we're seeing right now is attempts to adapt in the face of immense decapitation. At the same time, the decapitation has made them incredibly fragmented. So, far less easy to read, far less easy to predict. And so, to the point where some people would describe some actions as suicidal. And I think that fragmentation is key because it shows the kind of backlash of decapitation and military efforts to try and just whack these groups out, not knowing what could come next. So to answer your question, of course, there is still that connection to Iran. I do think that they're all in survival mode and making decisions based on what they believe their survival to be. Some of them are so fragmented that they're kind of fighting each other, and there's a lot of internal fighting as well, to that extent. But I think, moving forward and looking ahead, the region, even if there is a mission accomplished declared, the region will still see significant violence with these actors in all of the contexts in which they operate.
Can you just, I'd like to push you a little bit on something. So, oftentimes when people talk about these groups and this access, they talk about a top-down relationship with Iran, and perhaps that was a top-down relationship, full stop. So maybe that was the genesis of these groups, but is that still the case? Like, obviously, you're talking about a different logic for each group, but to what extent is there a sort of top-down relationship still remaining, particularly as the regime itself is fragmenting under the pressures of this war?
Yeah, I think certainly, especially after, as I said, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who was at that time still trying to cohere some of this network, you've seen the axis turn into more of this, a horizontal, you can say, organization in which you have different decision makers. At some point, Hassan Nasrallah was directing some of the axis, and now he's gone. So it's much more fragmented. It's much more decentralized. And as I say, each of these groups are making decisions based on what they believe to be their survival. So, to answer your bigger question, why did they fight now, or some of them at least, the Houthis, of course, are still not as much as in the past. But why did some of them fight now versus in the June war of 2025? And the answer is this word that everyone keeps using, this word of existential. This fight is seen to be an existential fight, not just to Iran, but to many of these groups. And so that kind of pragmatism of staying out of a very limited in scope war, I think they realize that this war now is different than any of the wars or conflicts since October 7th. This is a long-term fight, and it's about existence.
Thank you, Renard. Emil, I'd like to sort of continue the conversation with you. So, with that in mind, I mean, can you talk us through the Iranian calculus here regarding the Axis groups? How is Iran thinking about them? How have they used them at all in the last 3 weeks?
Um, I mean, just some context to this. I mean, Iran built these networks of influence. Well, to have influence first and foremost. Second, as it was a strategic pillar of its security policy. These groups were meant to deter and punish if need be. And from Iran's perspective, these partners have not deterred, and they haven't been able to punish with strategic effect. At no point that Hezbollah or the Houthis or others or groups in Iraq conduct operations that fundamentally shifted how Israel or the US saw the battlefield. So there's a significant failure. And I suspect that in the coming phase in Iran, there will be the question of why have we invested all this money, all these hopes, all this attention into that deterrence framework, perhaps at the expense of more straightforward conventional defense or other tools. I suspect that in Iran you'll have that debate, and perhaps it's already started about did it make sense to do so, and what is the use of these groups at this particular point. Um, we all, I think, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of that. I suspect others of having overstated in a way the cohesion and power of that network of influence. They were very good in meeting Iran's requirements in specific places and cities and capitals where they were dealing with weak actors, with corrupt actors, where their own discipline and sense of purpose and so on put them at the top, right? Whether it's in Beirut or Baghdad and so on. But faced with a militarily superior and intelligence superior enemy or enemies, they have not been able to keep up. And importantly, I think Iran's concept all along was to avoid an all-out war, because Iran understood that it wasn't able, it didn't have the capabilities to wage that. And instead, so it wasn't an all-out war from the beginning. But what Iran and its partners faced was essentially a war of attrition. And these groups were not necessarily, at least some of these groups were not necessarily made to sustain that kind of combat. And I certainly think that that's the case with Hezbollah. Its strategic arsenal was useful in this big in some big cataclysmic battle where it's the tempo, it's the mass that really mattered, and that's where the advanced capabilities, missile capabilities of Hezbollah were useful. And instead they faced a multi-month war of attrition in which the Israelis set the tempo. And I think at no point did Hassan Nasrallah or the IRGC strategists and so on figure out how to stay ahead in the game. They were always on the back foot. Now, for the past 3 weeks, I agree with Renat that this is existential as far as Hezbollah is concerned. It is, we can focus on the military aspect, and certainly Hezbollah has reorganized and so on. I would argue that on the strategic level, Hezbollah is not nearly as powerful as it was 2.5 years ago. Problems of supply, problems command and control, and so on. But they have probably reorganized to put on a good fight against the IDF on the ground. What the strategic effect will be, we'll have to see. But I don't think that we should expect big Hezbollah victories. And I would argue that Hezbollah remains a very powerful coercive force domestically in Lebanon, where they can punish, intimidate, possibly assassinate their enemies. So they're working on several fronts. Now, for Iran, here the issue is Iran would like the war in the Gulf to calm down as long as they're seen as having restored some level of deterrence. But on Lebanon, I think their view is they would like this to continue for some time, and they understand that the Israelis are in for several months. And I think that's the front, while it is a secondary front at the moment, that is likely to burn for longer, because both the Israelis see the opportunity and the political military opportunity, but also the Iranians see it as a place where they can bleed and distract the Israelis. And I think this is how they look at it. It's a way to entangle Israel in some messy new war with a strong ground element there. I'll stop there. I certainly won't mention Yemen and the Houthis because there's someone who's an expert on that. I'm not that person.
So just pushing on that. So, we're sort of getting indications that potentially Iran, even if things that they might not be willing to sort of stop firing and stop firing in this war if the Israelis weren't to stop on their attacks on Lebanon. So, do you see that? Is that possible based on everything you're hearing and seeing? Like, could the Iranians keep firing if Hezbollah was still coming under attack by the Israelis?
I think that there will be a divergence between the two, because with Iran they would want to consolidate the current status quo when they essentially have a selective control of the Strait of Hormuz, and if the other side agrees to it formally or informally, that's a strategic win. I don't want to say victory, but a strategic win for Iran. The question for them is, how do you look? Iran's today struggles to impose a cost on Israel. It's far away. They don't have enough of the right missiles. Israeli society is hardened. It's ready to take the pain and the risk. Iran doesn't have what it needs to change Israeli thinking. But I think Iran sees Hezbollah as being useful in this sense. They think that Hezbollah could bleed Israel, could impose a cost over time, can entangle Israel into a very messy war and so on. So I can see Tehran essentially saying, well, we'll freeze things in the Gulf, provided we have a satisfactory arrangement there that in a way enshrines our deterrent, a new deterrence equation. But if Hezbollah and Lebanon need to burn for Israel to be burn as well, then that's fine enough. And then you get into the Lebanese debate over Hezbollah. If that's the case, I mean, I always saw Hezbollah as a strategic extension of Iran. I mean, on those matters. And certainly, we see greater Iranian involvement inside Hezbollah at this point. Certainly, they played a big role in reorganizing the force after the debilitating blows it suffered in 2024. We'll see how effective that is. But the point is, from a Lebanese perspective, the debate over Hezbollah is going to intensify a lot more. It's Hezbollah's own posture, perhaps own mistakes that have reinvited the Israelis, and now have created the prospect of a long-lasting Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and perhaps worse. It's the Lebanese don't. Most of the Lebanese don't want that. Hezbollah is going to have to justify that, but perhaps the Israelis will give them the pretext by being an invading force, so you can recreate a sense of purpose, an idea. But definitely the Iranians would like to see this front on fire for weeks and months to come after whatever happens in the Gulf.
In terms of the sort of official Lebanon's relationship to Hezbollah, obviously it's under tremendous pressure by both Washington and the Israelis to do more on the Hezbollah front. But what are the constraints under which it's operating now, and can it do any more? And ultimately, is this pressure that's being put upon it hindering or fueling more tensions?
On the Lebanese government and the Lebanese, look, I mean, there is a real issue of capacity first and foremost, and we have to recognize this. And one can say that Lebanon is responsible for not having built a proper military all this time. The question is with which resources and what kind of support and so on. But the responsibility is first and foremost on the Lebanese state. The constraints are the following. First, since the 2024 ceasefire, Israel did violate that ceasefire considerably. And that has really prevented the Lebanese government from saying, look, a negotiated deal helps. It was, and Hezbollah really benefited from that. The fact that there was no real political track, there was no sense of American or French, because France is part of that so-called mechanism, really pressure on Israel, figuring out, how to tone things down, harassment of UNIFIL, for instance, and the fact that UNIFIL is its mandate is lapsing, essentially. So they struggle to make the diplomatic argument internally about why going in this direction. But the fact that Hezbollah has behaved the way it has, and especially that it entered the war on March 2nd, really has played very badly internally. And we saw the Lebanese government take some measures that are still symbolic measures with no practical implementation, but banning Hezbollah's military activities. You can say, well, there's no difference between Hezbollah's political wing and military wing. It's the same. But that's quite unprecedented. The fact that they're trying to clamp down on the word resistance in public declarations and format, that's also notable. But the issue is Hezbollah maintains coercive capabilities at home. It can do quite a lot of damage to the Lebanese polity. Second, the fact that everyone in Lebanon thinks that Israel has maximalist agenda, including territorial ambitions, really works across purpose from what a normal state response should be. And I would say that there's a lot of cynics in the Lebanese system saying there's nothing to be gained here. We shouldn't spread our meager resources, whatever capital and goodwill we have, and so on. So we stand as spectators while this war comes out, and depending on the balance of power at the end of that war, we'll figure out the way ahead. And I think there's a kind of resignation. Obviously, not necessarily acceptable from senior officials who are responsible for the fate of their country, but I would argue that's the prevalent mood. And by the way, lots of concerns about communal tensions inside the country, with a massive number of displaced people from one community thought to be sympathetic to Hezbollah moving into other neighborhoods. you see that the concern is at present is to avoid clashes on the ground that then escalate. It's not the civil war scenario; it's more the communal strife scenario that is looming, that the army and the security services will have to plan for.
Yeah. Thank you, Emil, for that excellent overview. Mace, I'd like to move on to you. So the question on everybody's mind in the last 3 weeks has been whether the Houthis will get involved, and what is their calculus here? The assumption seems to be, certainly from the Axis side, that Tehran can just ask the Houthis to come in at any point and they'll do it. Is that an accurate read of the dynamic? And just generally speaking, what's your assessment of the Houthis' current participation in the conflict?
First of all, there is some part of this question is wrong, actually, because it's impossible in any way that the Houthis, the Iranian, ask them to interfere, and the Houthis say, okay, we are busy in our internal issues, come to us maybe next year. It's impossible to say this, something like that. And it's at the same way that an orders. I mean, they don't receive orders from the Iranian, just do this or don't do that. The Houthis, they are ideologically committed to the Iranian axis and to the Iranian revolutionary ideology. They are not from the same Shia faction. They are Shia, but from a different school. But at the same time, they are still ideological committed, and they have regional ambitions. And we should understand that the Houthis, they define themselves not a local group, but as a cross borders group, or and they want to interfere. Definitely, they will not miss something like that huge, and the Iranian state is facing an existential threat like this one. Definitely, the Iranian, they invest in Houthi for years in weaponizing them, and they are the main source of weapons for the Houthis in training them. So they can't also abandon their only ally and sincere ally, and it's a very vital ally for them, and abandon them at this point. And definitely the Iranian regime is no close to fall down. And all of this talk about falling down the regime it's very clear it is unrealistic. The question here, when the Houthis are going to interfere and why? First of all, we have to understand that the proxies, especially the Houthis, their importance become less if Iran acts directly. If Iran doesn't act, here they are more important, because at this point, the Iranian, they don't want to carry the burden or to receive any reaction for their, to receive any retaliation for their actions. But once the Iranian, they already are in the center of the conflict. So how they are going to deal with the different factions, with the different proxies, this is the question. When we need them, this is the question. For the Iranian, for example, geographically, the Gulf states are closer to them. For them, for Israel, they can shower the Israelis by missiles and drones from Iran more than the Houthis. And at the same point, it is important for them as a state to retaliate by themselves, not by other proxies. They don't need that. But they need the Houthis for other things. For example, if they want to disturb the routes, the maritime in the Red Sea, at this point, the Houthis are very important. At this point, if they want to disturb the Saudi Plan B to export the oil from the Red Sea ports, at this point, the Houthis are important. If the Saudis interfere in the war, at this point, the Houthis are very important. And you can see that from the military movement of the Houthis and the military mobilization of the Houthis on the ground. And now their army is on the coast, on the western coast in the Red Sea, and on the borders with Saudi Arabia. And they are in standby. And many official statements from many Houthi leaders, they talk about, we are ready to engage. And I think this kind of statements is to reassure their ideological core, that they don't abandon their ideological commitment for any reason, for any pragmatic reasons, as some people say. And we are still committed, and we are going to fire when it is necessary. And the question, when it is necessary, this is the question.
But it's interesting that they haven't done anything even symbolic, that there have been no sort of one missile launch, one something. How do you explain that?
They don't need to make it be symbolic now. It's not the time for being symbolic, because it is different than Gaza war. Now you have to be function and to make something really significant that can change the course of the war. Because definitely when we talk about the Palestinian cause, first of all, it is a very emotional cause. I mean, it's not something like supporting Iran. Supporting Iran is part of your ideological commitment as part of the Iranian axis. But if you are going to support Palestine, so you are going to support a cause that no question about it in Yemen, for example. It's always something very emotional. It received a kind of popular support and popular legitimacy. It's very easy to justify that. Although the Houthis, when the war of Gaza starts to continue, and the Yemenis start to receive, very tough strikes in return of their attacks, symbolic attacks, as you said. At this point, the people start to question the point of the Houthi attacks. And at that point, I think not only the Houthis, I think all of the Iranian proxies, including Hamas, they don't imagine that the Israelis will go that far, whether in time, whether in attacking others. They didn't imagine this scenario. So I think now they know, they prepare themselves for the worst case scenario. And the Iranians is very clear, they prepare themselves for a long confrontation. Their smuggling of weapons to the Houthis since last June, after what happened to them, the 12 days, until now, have been increased and intensified to the Houthis. So this means they prepare themselves that the Houthis will interfere at any point if they are going to face the scenario of attacking them again.
And so you think that this ideological commitment, this sort of deep-seated relationship with Iran and the network, that supersedes any ambitions that it has with its relationships sort of in the Gulf. So its relationship with Iran is more important than its prospective relationship with Saudi Arabia at the moment.
Look, the roadmap actually is become dead. I mean, Houthis in their ideological core, even without Iran, they are anti-Saudi Arabia. Remove the Iranian factor, they are anti-Saudi Arabia. It is part of their ideology. It's part of their ideology, even the ideology of the father of Abdul Malik al-Houthi. So they are very anti-Saudi Arabia. This is ideologically, it is done. I mean, it is defined, it is well defined. But even practically, they engage with the Saudis in negotiation for a peace settlement, which was really good for them before Gaza war. But this peace settlement now, even this peace settlement now is dead because of the sanctions, because of their intervention in Gaza, because now they have a regional intervention, and that this changed the perspective of the global perspectives to Houthis. So now there are some demands that this peace settlement should include some parts or some new items that Houthis committed that they are not going to attack the maritime in the Red Sea again. Also, the sanctions make some terms or some parts of this roadmap are not something actionable. It can be implemented, actually. So I think the Saudis, they renegotiate with them. They resume negotiation with them in the time between ending the Gaza war until eruption of this war against Iran. But I think they are buying time more than they are really serious to settle or to make a settlement with the Houthis, because they know that the Houthis, they are going to be targeted by Israel at any time. And this is another issue. And the Houthis, they prepare themselves for this scenario. the scenario of attacking them by Israel from Somaliland mainly. Now there are many talks that Israel presents in Somaliland. It aims to target the Houthis. And the Houthis, they prepare themselves for this scenario.
Thank you, Mesa. And there are a few questions about the Houthi specifically, so we'll Renard, I just wanted to turn to you now. So if you could talk us through the Iraqi militia, the plethora of Iraqi militia groups and their sort of calculus right now. Obviously, in Iraq right now, we're seeing what some are calling a shadow front. It is the scene of massive escalation between the US and Iranian proxies. Can you tell us a little bit about what's actually happening there and which groups are participating, which groups aren't, and why?
Yeah, I think it was your article that called it the shadow war. But very much, I think it is so. Iraqis like to say in the weird humor of Iraqis under so much crisis that it's the only country that all sides are fighting each other and it's fighting itself basically. And you had attacks from different PMF groups and militias as well as from the US in inside Iraq. I think something important in our conversation today is we keep trying to relate what's happening now to the previous times of violence. So even these things like symbolic violence or limited scope, I think the game has changed. And there are several ways in which the games have changed. And you see it also in Iraq. I mean, look at Iran's policy in Iraq. Iraq was more important to Iran than any of these other countries, no offense. Or maybe it's better, I don't know. Iran had, for security reasons and economic reasons, a need for Iraq to remain stable to the point where it made groups like Kataib Hezbollah cease fire after they accidentally killed 3 Americans a few years ago, and Iran in the June war of last year was very much trying to restrain these groups. That restraint is no longer there. In fact, Iran is no longer playing by that because the status quo has changed. Iran is changing the status quo. Iran is changing the logics of violence that it and its groups will use. And in that, these groups now realize that they are in an existential fight. So you have certain groups in the PMF, which recently have become part of the Iraqi government, really into the Iraqi government. I mean, one example is Qais al-Khazali, who is the leader of Asa'ib al-Haq. His political party in the last election was had the most seats for the Shia. And you can go on and on with different PMF leaders who have become statesmen inside the state. So from their perspective, war is bad for business. And so there has been a lot written about the fact that, these groups might not actually want to be fighting for Iran. However, and Qasem Soleimani used to always complain about this, but the many different groups in Iraq made it much more difficult than, for example, other Axis groups. And who is the leader of these groups? There isn't a top-down model. And so Kataib, Hezbollah, and all of these other vanguard groups, and the Jabhat, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, and many other groups, they are using violence. They are fighting. Not in the short term. They see this as a fight. This is it. The sort of box has been opened, and it won't be closed. This is not violence for political negotiation. This is violence for changing realities on the ground. And the biggest concern, I mean, just this weekend, there was these groups also attacked the Iraqi intelligence building and killed an Iraqi intelligence officer. So this could spiral in Iraq into something akin to or glimpses of a civil war between these groups as they fight each other, those who want to hang on to power and maintain stability, and those who see this as not in their best interest and would rather be fighting a more existential fight. So to conclude, I think this debate around pragmatism and ideology is important because each group considers survival based on both of those. And I think that and therefore Iraq, I think, even if there is a kind of mission accomplished declared, will continue to be a battleground.
It's almost like the policies of the last 20 years of creating fragmented statehood in Iraq and decentralized power is coming home to roost, right? And I think what I'm curious about how you see, not only this attack on the INIS in Baghdad, but beyond that, I mean, where is the state? What is the tension currently between the militia apparatuses and the state? Like, can the government do anything? Can Soudani, as caretaker prime minister, do anything to rein in these groups, given that you have powerful militias already in the government?
Yeah, and I think certainly also important to note that a lot of the attention, a lot of the attacks have been in the Kurdistan region as well. So it's both the Iraqi government cannot, and the Kurdistan region is complaining of why the Iraqi government, if it claims to be against these groups, why can't it stop these attacks from happening? There is a massive sovereignty, deficiency. The Iraqi prime minister, although his name is commander in chief, is not the commander in chief. In fact, you have many different commanders all over, parts of Baghdad and the country that are calling the shots. And the reality is that, as you said, in this fragmented kind of state, the lessons that Iraqis have learned from military superiority and decapitation and military solutions is what it produces is sure a degraded security sector, but a less predictable and more unstable security sector at the same time. And that's what they're living through 20 years on.
Yeah. Thank you, Renard. I'd lastly like to turn, but certainly not least, turn to Barbara, who's been waiting very patiently throughout this whole debate, even though there's so much to comment on in terms of what the US policy is right now. So following on from these sort of comments that Renard just make about Iraq and the state, I mean, the place where the US has been most active apart from Iran is Iraq. So it's something that I'm struggling to understand the contours of, given that the US hasn't really taken public credit for any of these attacks against some militias, including headquarters and assassination attempts. So could you help us think through what the US strategy is here?
Sure, Raya. Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that going after the axis of resistance is not the main game. It's not even in the top tier, several sort of priorities for the administration right now. Of course, we all woke up this morning to the news that President Trump had suspended the ultimatum that was to expire this evening in Washington, the 48-hour ultimatum for the Iranians to open the Strait of Hormuz or else face withering attacks on their energy infrastructure. So it's a 5-day reprieve. The Iran theater is the main game, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. And when I look at the map of the axis, as my colleagues have, elegantly laid it out, you've essentially longstanding sort of not subcontracting so much as ceding the issue of Hezbollah to Israel, full stop. There are very fitful efforts, responses by the administration, usually Tom Barrack, to engage politically, but largely, as we heard Emil lay out, it has been a sort of hectoring kind of message to the Lebanese government: take care of Hezbollah, and if not, the Israelis will. So the Israelis are in the middle of that. With the militias, that's where it's quite interesting, but I do not think we should mistake this for sort of a bit of strategery, if you will, in George W. Bush's wonderful term. That is to say, the U.S. military is seizing the operational opportunity in the midst of this conflict to really go at the various groups, starting with KH, but not only. Going in with one of the first shots was going into that no-go zone, Jurf al-Sakar, and smashing that to pieces, attempting decapitation strikes and so forth. This, in a normal sort of steady state peacetime, would be really untenable for Baghdad itself. And in the melee that we see right now, where as Renaud very nicely laid it out, there is a sort of Iraqi on Iraqi, Iraqi on Iraqi Kurd sort of dynamic. The U.S. is coming in and doing its punching. Now, does it have a strategic purpose? Well, I think it's just do what is being done to Iran, which is smash decapitation strikes, smash the infrastructure, etc. And what does that leave on the other end? Well, presumably groups that are either cowed or at least unable to threaten the now starkly diminished U.S. diplomatic and military presence on the other side. And then the Houthi, well, look, I mean, I think the Trump administration found out, like the Biden administration did, how hard it is to get at the Houthi and really when they are going after shipping, including U.S. Naval ships. It is a very labor intensive and not a lot of, well, immediate benefit to targeting them. So as long as the Houthi are offside, then the U.S. is leaving that for another scenario. But I think the thing that will continue to be the dynamic theater is, of course, Iraq. Now, what that does to Iraq's own politics and the militia politics will be a very interesting thing. But I suffice to say, there's nobody who, at a senior level, has been the Iraq desk officer, if you will, on a senior policy level. It is very haphazard, and so the military is doing what the military doesn't always have the opportunity to do.
I mean, just on that, the propensity for instability is enormous for Iraq at a particularly
Yes.
precarious moment in its history. And as you say, there isn't someone senior running Iraq policy. I mean, to what degree is anyone thinking about what this means
Um,
for Iraq after this war ends?
So I would argue, and I think Renard made a really good point that this could be, a presage to actual civil war. But I am more concerned in the immediate as to the debilitating, destructive effect on a continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz on Iraq, because you've had
Mhm.
something on the order of 70% of the oil production just shut down. That damages wells when you have to shut them in, but most importantly, a government that requires that draws 90% of it, 90% of its spending money from oil production is going to be hammered. So what does that do internally? And this, oh, there's a 5-day reprise or suspense of this threat to go kinetic. The Iranians, of course, have played back, you go kinetic on our energy infrastructure, sky's the limit. And they've made it clear they don't intend to just limit themselves to the Gulf. So you could see more strikes on Iraq itself, not just on the KRG. And so that is the wolf nearest the sled. Is the administration thinking about that as it deliberates over the how and when of winding this war down, or what sort of formula will get the strait open? Impossible to say, but unfortunately I do not see Iraq's stability at the top of the list of concerns for this administration, although it should be.
And that certainly was raised when there was all this talk of the Iranian Kurds getting involved in the first week of the war, right? I mean, that
Well,
was.
look, I think Ankara came calling. So it was not only Baghdad being horrified, but most importantly, the Turks, whom the White House has a lot of time for, immediately got on the phone and said, "Don't even think about it."
Mhm. And on that, there were reports last week that the Americans were pressuring Sheddah and Syria to get involved with potential cross-border attacks against Hezbollah into Lebanon. I mean, is that something viable?
No, we don't want to see Greater Syria reemerge in some fashion. It's not viable. Look, I think to put it mildly, there's a lot of spaghetti being thrown against the wall in Washington. Ideas to discombobulate the axes, to discombobulate Iran. But the hard nut of the problem is what you do about a regime that now has a stranglehold on the global economy.
Thank you, Barbara. And that brings us to the end of my questions. So I'd like to turn now to questions from the audience, of which there are quite a few. So the first question I'd like to look at is whether or not is from Maren Hupner. And this question is, how possible is it that these conflicts will lead to the formation of new militias? So if we look at Israel's invasions of Lebanon in the 1980s, Hezbollah emerged precisely as a counter movement in southern Lebanon in response to Israel's intervention. So what do we think the likelihood is at this moment of new militias being created? Maybe Renard, you can start us off with that.
I mean, in Iraq, there's a new militia announced every few weeks, so I think it's certainly there. What I would sort of highlight as well is the propensity over time for further radicalization in these societies. I mean, a lot of people, even who may have been anti-Iran, especially because Iran was this power in the region, living under an Israeli region or living under a region where Israel is destructive and the US is this destructive will breed a new wave of radicalization and will breed a new wave of armed actors and groups. So I think, you know, as I said, what we know that these wars have done is maybe kill the leaders, but not end the movements. And in fact, these movements then splinter. And it becomes a sort of not hierarchical, but a horizontal, network of all of these different leaders, each without any command structure. So it becomes again more unstable. So anyway, to answer the question, I think in Iraq it's already happening, and certainly there will be violence in the decades to come, let alone years, based on these moments. And that the Iraq War 2003 tells us what happens with these types of military campaigns.
Emil, what about you?
I mean, new militias can certainly emerge in Lebanon, possibly Syria, depending on how the fragmentation of these arenas goes. But some existing actors can simply morph. You can see Hezbollah essentially splitting depending on the mission. It may have still like some kind of central command, but it'll have to do more communal self-defense because Lebanon will be marred in sectarian tensions and so on. And so the mission of Hezbollah will have to change. One of them is fighting Israel at home and abroad. Another one will be protecting the Shia community, or at least the standing that it has acquired in the past few years, and then finding new or building new relationships with opportunistic groups, but also groups that emerge from the new radicalization in the region. So you can see a scenario in which Hezbollah is at odds with Druze or Sunni groups in Lebanon, but then finding some interlocutor in Syria to facilitate new smuggling routes or finding new depths and so on. So it's really a moment of it's likely that we will see real fragmentation, almost extreme fragmentation going forward. Obviously, bad news for Syria. It just got a chance to consolidate, and now it may go in the other direction. And I think in Lebanon, I mean, given the trajectory of events, more likely than not, the state will weaken. Despite what some of people in Washington say or would like to believe. So yeah, I mean, more turbulence going forward.
Thanks, Emil. We just have a question on Yemen, so I'll turn to Mesa for this one. From a humanitarian/safety point of view, and this is a question from Ninka Sharp, what would be the effect within Yemen, both north and south, if the Houthis do get involved in attacking or will be attacked?
Definitely the effect will be huge, but the effect of continuing the war is also huge because the main donors, they are the Gulf states, maybe Saudi Arabia. So Yemen will not be priority for them. Yemen is not priority for the humanitarian aids actually, since the Ukrainian war, then the sanctions, then the detention of the Houthis. The Houthi arrest many workers in the humanitarian aids, and then the US withdrawal from this humanitarian aid. So anyhow, the humanitarian aids in Yemen have been degraded a big deal since 2023. And then the important part, it is the Israelis, when they strike Yemen, the many times they did since 2024, the behavior, the impunity, the Israelis, they behave in deep sense of impunity. So they strike some vital infrastructure, like the airport, like the ports, like some factories. So definitely this will cause really a serious damage on the economic situation. And I have to say that the economic situation in the Houthi territories is dire more than any time before. And there is a kind of moving from the capitals and the people who work in business from the Houthi territories to the government areas. So yeah, I think it will be difficult.
Thank you, Mesa. Barbara, we have a question in from Vijay Shrao. Is this divide and rule, keep turmoil in the region rather than peace?
Well, if that's Washington, no, I don't think so. Is it the approach of the Israeli government? I think it's been clear from Israeli statements going back a year or more, and especially in terms of the approach that the Prime Minister Netanyahu took towards the new Syria, that the belief was destabilize, weaken the center, you have less of an immediate foe in your neighborhood. It's the same approach Israel's taking towards Iran. I think Washington's approach, the administration's approach, is not so much divide and rule, but it was a vast overreach and operating on a set of assumptions going into this war that were disastrously poorly thought out. The assumptions were just simply wrong, and the repercussions, the implications of a longer than several days war are clear and they're deepening. But I don't think it's really a divide and rule approach by Washington. It's rather President Trump expected to be able to get a Venezuela out of Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and still looking for that.
One wonders how that was the expectation, given all the information that preceded it. But
It's the
yes,
structure of the administration that permitted it, which is to say a decoupling of the national security, as they call it, deep state, from the senior-most levels of decision making. It's a tiny group. There is nobody who really deeply questions the president when he sets on a course.
thank you, Barbara. Actually, just a follow-up question. When it comes to Iraq, do these sort of decapitation strikes, are they seen as effective generally? I mean, and I'm comparing it to the sort of post-2023 October 7th period.
I think when you're able to do something, then the impetus is to do it. Tactically, you get results, but I don't think anybody is taking into account the knock-on effects over time and this disintegration. It's not an eradication of the elements that are feeding on the Iraqi state and that have undermined the Iraqi state's sovereignty for years now. It's rather it disintegrates into cellular elements, and there's every opportunity or likelihood of radicalization. And I don't think they're thinking in those terms.
Thanks, Barbara. We've got a question coming in from Harshit Mansukhani, who asks, will the post-war economic pressure fundamentally reshape how Iran supports its proxy network, shifting from direct funding to a more self-sustaining and decentralized model? And what does this mean for its ability to balance domestic reconstruction with maintaining regional influence? Emil, could you take that question, please?
Certainly, I think this is a massive challenge for Iran going forward. The cost of sustaining all these partners hasn't been massive, and in a number of places, certainly Iraq, which has generated a lot of cash, or Lebanon, where Hezbollah has been able to go into criminal activities or trafficking or whatever, or the Houthis who found a way to, make some money out of maritime trade, and those groups were able to get their some funding elsewhere. But Iran was central to turning these groups into more strategic actors by providing them certain types of technology, intelligence support, logistical support, and so on. And it's not just the money that went to that, it's the cost of offering that expertise and technology. And going forward, Iran, in my view, will prioritize the core, its own defense, the rebuilding of its own capabilities, because it will exist in a transformed environment with no friends at all, willing to, countenance its mood and so on, especially in the Gulf. So these other actors are going to have to figure out for themselves how they survive. So they'll become more of a bloodsuckers essentially on whatever exists. A shrinking Lebanese economy, a transformed Iraqi economy that perhaps cannot export nearly as much oil as it did, but they still on top of things. The question is, what expectations would Iran have from these groups going forward? And I think the Iranians will probably come to the conclusion that you cannot build a tool of deterrence, like a credible tool of deterrence against significantly superior enemies, Israel and the US. So they're going to have to decide, what is this about? Is it harassment? Is it influence? Is it, pure terrorism? Is it, so they're going to have to engage in some of that strategic thinking about what is the value of these groups going forward, and then decide how many resources to devote to these missions. And I think we're at the beginning of that.
Renard, I just wanted to ask you, since you've done a lot of work on how these groups finance themselves, particularly in Iraq, and obviously Iraq has been considered a cash cow for Iran historically. But in the last 3 weeks, it's shown a willingness to sort of blow up Iraq's ability to generate its revenue through the disruption to its oil production. How do you explain that? And do you see that as having a long-term impact on the militia group's abilities to self-fund?
Well, I think Emil is correct that we often think that Iran was just funding these groups, but Iran needed these groups in Iraq to generate access to US dollars, to gain access to blending fuel and all of these activities. So these groups, it's not just about the kind of security architecture that this influence. There's a much more to it than that I think it needs. I think the Iraqi government's asking why, after all these years and the brotherhood between the two countries, why Iraqi ships are getting attacked and why they're the ones not going through the strait. So there certainly is a dynamic there that is antagonistic. For a very long time, Iraq was the lifeline of Iran's sanctioned economy, and now Iraq feels like Iran is sanctioning it. And so I think moving forward, Iraq is in a very difficult economic situation. It's barely able to pay its public sector, bloated public sector salaries. And it's very likely, it's declared force majeure on several contracts and several companies. And we know with the summer months coming, there will be less electricity, which comes from Iran. There's less medicine, there's less food because of the strait being closed. There is a crisis going on economically inside Iraq in the next year.
Barbara, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I think one other element to take into account is the particular place that Iraq as a country occupies in Tehran's national security perspective. Once upon a time, it was the country that attacked and fought a brutal 8-year war. And so I've long seen Iran's foreign policy towards Iraq, and when it comes to the militias, as being part of that eating away at core sovereignty of whatever government is in place, because you can never assume from Tehran that you've got complete control over it. So you keep it in a gentle state of insecurity, instability, never enjoying full sovereignty. The question is where Iran overplays that and it tips into something else, like the cataclysmic crisis of the spring and summer of 2014.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention. That's useful context. So, Renard, we have another question that sort of speaks to this issue of sovereignty in Iraq. So, Faisullah Tunaygun asks, government formation process in Iraq is largely halted or has been largely halted due to the war. Do you think there'll be a unified coordination framework after this? And how would Shia groups in return try to form the government?
So I think it's in these moments that exposes the kind of fragmented, muddling through types of governments. For a long time, the coordination framework knew they had a problem. In fact, they knew that there was groups in the PMF that were now part of the state, but then they had what they call the factions, and they knew the factions were a problem, but they just didn't get around to any kind of strategic thinking of what to do with them. And they just muddled through hoping that this day would never come. But we are now in the worst case scenario for the region and for Iraq. And in this worst case scenario, the coordination framework is now people are asking, where were you? You've been governing, you've been building bridges, you've been insulating Iraq. Why haven't you been able to create a coherent security sector? Why are you unable to stop these very small number of fighters with with drones that are barely, can't really create much damage? Why can't you stop them? This is not a sophisticated network, and you still don't have the abilities. And now you have in your government people like PMF leaders Hadi al-Amri, Qais al-Khazali, and others. So I think, I think the coordination framework is in a very difficult position. Certainly, they are still driving the government formation process, and they are still the one representative of the Shia. Of course, Muqtada Sadr is a question that is on the side of this, but there are big challenges now internally as to why the Iraqi state can it continue to survive in this fragmented way.
Yeah. Um, Emil, we have a question from David Brennan from ABC News that kind of picks up on this idea of fragmented states. Might a prolonged Hezbollah-Israel conflict prove an existential threat for the Lebanese state, if it's not already? And is a scenario possible in which the government and or other factions implicitly or explicitly coordinate with Israel in disarming Hezbollah? This is sort of going deeper than that on your comments earlier about the challenges for the state and the army.
Well, I do see that as the most existential moment for Lebanon, because and without ranking these various challenges and so on. I mean, first, you may have a permanent redrawing of human geography inside Lebanon. If Israel does indeed occupy for a long time the south and look at it as a like New Golan Heights, which is, I think, possible, then you essentially have depopulated a major area, and then you have a few hundred thousands of people moving elsewhere, which is and that will add to many problems. And I think a Lebanon in which so much territory is occupied will struggle to enter any kind of like genuine peace negotiations with Israel. I don't think they could be a central authority with enough strength and legitimacy. Hezbollah itself will look at the rest of Lebanon as having been treacherous, not having stood by and in that existential moment. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see in addition to communal violence, more targeted hits, including assassinations inside the country. And if the military is not and the security forces are not able to prevent that or contain this and so on, then you can easily see a loss of trust in central institution, which is already very low. Let's be clear. The external pressure is also significant. I mean, the Americans essentially have washed their hands off of Lebanon. I can understand it can be very frustrating to deal with Beirut at times, but it's also the fact that the U.S. can be overly heavy-handed or unreasonable at times, and the diktats and also in Washington there are people who have this illusion that you can break the back of Hezbollah if only there was a bit more a spine in Beirut, and then the solution is around the corner and so on. It's very difficult to see that. I think it's quite unfortunate because the dynamic that started in January 2025 with the election of the new president and the new prime minister offered some optimism. And we saw them really struggling over the past year plus to align expectations with realities. One can say that there was significant development, but I think at this point they have so few levers because internationally, what's happening in the Gulf is so big that there is very few countries really investing any attention, any time, and so on Lebanon. You have pro forma statements that we don't want that, it's de-escalation, but that's the extent of it. I think the two countries here are the US most powerful, but as I said, not really engaged, and France struggling because Lebanon is quite important for Paris for a number of reasons, but not really, with no influence on any of the actors, and quite a lot of disappointment at France's previous roles. So who looks forward? I mean, and by the way, the Gulf states, are focused on their issues, understandably, and very frustrated at the whole Lebanon bit. And importantly, and then we saw this in the UAE. That they say they've dismantled a number of Hezbollah cells there, and so on. So the goodwill towards Lebanon, which was also low, is probably reducing even more. So it's really the worst possible combination of factors for Lebanon at this point. It's just that if there's some wisdom, how do you start rebuilding if you go and break everything there, and which is very possible. I just think that with an economy that's in tatters and with an infrastructure that's being bombed and the state and the army losing legitimacy and so on, what's the starting point? A day after, whatever it is. So I'm quite pessimistic. My parents will not like that once they see the footage of this this panel. But as a cold-blooded analyst, I just really struggle to see what the optimistic scenario is there.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that assessment, Emil. Mesa, I just wanted to come back to you on something because we've been talking a lot about fragmentation in these groups, and that has a lot to do with decapitation strikes over the last 5-6 years. But the Houthis seem to have bucked that trend. I mean, you haven't had a major leadership decapitation for the Houthis. So has that resulted in sort of more centralized decision making, and if there were to be a decapitation strike, if the Israelis, if they do get involved, and then the Israelis and the US may carry out sort of severe retaliation, what does that mean for the Houthi movement's future and challenges of governance in Yemen?
First of all, the Houthis, they are very centralized group, and because how it was revolved as a rebellion group, small rebellion group against the central government in a small far area of Yemen. So to keep their continuous or to keep their existence, they have to be very centralized because to keep exist and resilience in front of this major power in front of them. So mainly Abdel Malik al-Houthi monopolized the making decisions. It's only about him and the small group around him. Abdel Malik al-Houthi doesn't trust mainly the people in general, only trust the people who fought with him during the early fightings against the Yemeni government, and Saada wars from 2004 until 2010. It's a very small group. And now the Houthis, we are talking about a group that it is still young. Most of them, they are in the mid of the 40s when we talk about this generation, but there is a new generation is emerged, and there is no handing over to this new generation, while the first generation start to vanish. I mean, the second line, the third line have been killed during the fighting with Saudi Arabia. And the first line, they lost really important and key figures during their confrontation with Israel. And I think that since the Israeli attack on their capital in last August, they start to be panic because they thought their instructions to their members that don't touch the smartphones, don't deal with the technology. They gave them some instructions, security instructions to avoid the scenario of Hezbollah. And they thought this will protect them. but it has not. So this was very alarming for them. And they thought that they are not immune from this scenario. So Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he chose successor for him. They prepared their military factions to work and to act even if there is no leader. I mean, even he tried to decentralize the group. And definitely decentralizing the group could could cause many risks to the group in the future, but not now, definitely. But there is a kind of decentralizing the group because he wants to let the group function even if the leadership have been targeted. And also the successor of Abdul Malik al-Houthi, whoever he, and he's not announced, it's not necessary to enjoy the same position of the Houthi, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, because Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he is the leader of the group when the group was very young, was very small, and he gained his reputation as a divinely supported leader because of the many factories that he conducted through his through this time since 2006 until now. We are talking about 20 years of leadership. So it will not be an easy moving from the leadership of Abdul Malik al-Houthi to another one. As I said, it is a very centralized group. It's based on an individual. There is no institution. There is a structure, but there is no institution in this group.
Thanks, Maysa. We have a couple minutes left, so I just there's one question that's come in that I'm adapting slightly. Sorry, apologies to Damien Jones, but he asks if the US and Israel continues its decapitation strikes on the leadership and institutions of the Islamic Republic, as well as collateral damage of ordinary Iranian citizens, does all of that risk mobilizing Arab Shias across the Middle East and beyond for violence against citizens of both countries? And what I'd add to that is we've seen a lot of Shia mythology and ideology sort of suffuse a lot of the moments after Khamenei's assassination, and we've seen the sort of narrative of Karbala being used quite a lot to sort of mobilize the masses. So do you see and we've seen that from Lebanon to Pakistan and beyond. So I'm sort of curious as to this ideology. We talk a lot about ideology with these groups. Like, can we see a sort of, I know we mentioned radicalization earlier, but can we see a sort of mass mobilization of Shias around the world following all of this campaign? Maysa, would you like to speak to that?
Maybe Yemen is the least Shia in this
Yeah.
group. Because the Zaydis always define themselves as a fifth school of the Sunnis, actually. Sometimes.
Yeah.
They like to present themselves as some people in the middle. Definitely the Houthis are somehow different, but they represent a small part of the Zaydis in Yemen. So,
Yeah.
and I have to say that there is, the Yemenis, they don't like Iran that much. They always, for example, they support Iraq into safely. I mean, it's they were very strong supporters of Iraq during the Iraqi-Iranian war. And they have that strong feeling of being Arab versus Iran. I mean, they have that idea in their mind. So I'm not sure that this can touch the Yemenis that much. Maybe the Lebanese or the Iraqis better than me.
Renard, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to see exactly where things go from here. I mean, this is one of those moments. It's one of those defining moments in the region that we can no longer predict. Things are out of control. Nobody would have. A lot of people would not have predicted before 2003 that Iran's networks would become as strong as they became after 2003. So we're sitting in the middle of this war. But all that we can do is look at how things have worked in the past. And certainly these types of decapitation, attempts and military, sort of accomplishments will produce a quick win but will also produce all sorts of different problems down the line. And certainly radicalization is one of them. And certainly, even in Iraq right now, you're beginning to see in the south more and more Shia, as you're saying, narratives coming out. Karbala being referred to, this battle, and so yes, it's about supply chains. Yes, it's about survival. Yes, it's about making money, but this ideology is going to be further fueled by this war.
Well, with that, I want to thank the panelists and their wealth of expertise for such a rich discussion today. Thank you all for your time, and thank you to the audience for your excellent questions. We are officially out of time, and I'll get in trouble if this extends any further. So thank you everyone for your time, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.